Hey everyone, and welcome to the 20th tutorial in our Python Language Basics course. Here we're going to start a brand new topic. This will be all about functions. As per usual, we'll just spend some time in the slides talking about what functions are and what they can do for us in code. We're going to start by covering what are functions, again exploring these from a programming perspective. Then we'll get into specific parts of functions such as parameters and return values. We'll talk about what they can bring to the table and how we can use them to improve our functions. For starters, what are functions? Functions are simply self-contained blocks of code that remain kind of hidden away in our program and executed exactly when and where we want to execute them. So again, that code remains hidden until we run the function. This is very, very useful to us because we really don't want to run all of the code all of the time. We want certain events to trigger certain code, and we saw a little bit of that with control flow, but functions allow a finer tuned control over how things are going to run. Also, one of the other benefits of functions, other than hiding away the code and choosing when and where we want to execute it, is that we get to write the code once and execute it many times. Okay, that's different from writing a loop, because with a loop, we are again executing the code many times, but we'll only ever execute the code in the loop body while we're in that loop. Well, with functions, we can write the code within a function and then run it at any point in time in any part of the program where it's appropriate. In order to run the code within a function, we have to do what's called calling upon the function. So there are two stages to building and executing a function. There is the implementation, so that is just kind of specifying how the function is going to work, writing the actual code that goes in the function, passing in any inputs or outputs, and there is the actual calling upon the function that will just run the code within the function. So functions can receive inputs and produce outputs. Inputs are going to be fed in through what are called parameters, and outputs are going to be specified through what are called return statements. So let's get into the specifics of these inputs and outputs and how they're going to work for our overall functions. So the inputs are called parameters. These are often called arguments, and we can have 0 or more of these. So that means that a lot of the functions that we write throughout our programming careers will have 0 parameters. A lot of functions don't actually need any inputs. Okay. As far as the type of inputs a function can receive, well, there's really no limit. We can pass in, let's say, strings or integers or floats or booleans. We can pass in custom objects. And the nicest thing about Python functions is that we don't even have to specify a type when assigning a parameter. Okay, so because types are flexible in Python. When we pass parameters into a function, we can treat these like regular variables within a function, okay? So let's say we pass in some integer variable, we can treat it just like we would any other variable while we're within that function. Outside of the function, it doesn't really exist, but within the function, it's as if we have access to this other variable. When we call upon a function to execute the code, we have to pass in the values, at least one for each of our parameters. So if our function has 2 parameters, we need to pass in 2 values when we call upon the function. There are kind of workarounds for this. We can provide default values for variable or for these parameters if we don't necessarily need to pass in values, but we'll kind of get into the subtleties a little later on. Now, when we are using these default variables or the default values for these parameters, we can pass in alternative values, or we can just kind of stick with the default value. That way we don't have to pass in a specific value when calling upon the function. What about return values? Return values are essentially just outputs from a function. Now, in a lot of other languages, when you write a function, you have to again specify the name, the type of the inputs, types of the parameters. You don't have to do that in Python. But most languages also require you to specify the type of your outputs or the type of your return values. That's actually not necessary in Python. We can just output a variable, and then it's up to us to determine what type that is when we call upon the function. We specify these in the function body with a return statement. Once again, not all functions will necessarily return a specific value. Some of them will just kind of finish running and that's it. But if we do want to output a value when a function finishes running, we add a return value or return statement. Now, once a function reaches a return statement, it breaks and it may output a value if we are returning a specific value, or it may just exit the function and that's it. It's executed the code, it's done, there's nothing more to do. However, once it reaches a return statement, regardless of whether we're outputting a value or not, the function stops running and exits out of its body. If there is no return statement, a function will simply break out after the last statement. So remember, with a while loop, we could use break statements, or I guess with a for loop, we could use break statements to exit out of a while loop prematurely. Return statements act very, very similar to that. But the bigger difference is that if we get to the end of the function and there is no return statement, we just exit out of the function rather than running it again. Okay, so it's different from a loop in that regard. We can then use the output like a variable when we're calling upon the function. So let's say we're calling upon a function that produces a numerical output. We can capture that output when we call upon the function, store it in a variable, treat it just as we would any other numerical variable. However, just like before, outputs don't have to have a specific type. They will have a type assigned to them when we output them, but there's no limit as to what that type needs to be. We can also output multiple values, so we could output, let's say, a list or a tuple. It's very, very flexible as to what we can do with these return values, as well as with parameters in Python. So that is pretty much it. Just to quickly summarize, functions are just self-contained blocks of code that are run, and then they can take in input or produce output. We choose exactly when and where we want to execute these functions. The benefits are A, that we don't necessarily run the code all the time, and B, that we can execute the code multiple times in different parts of the program, even though we're only writing it once, and we do want to avoid repeating code where possible. There are inputs into functions called parameters. There is no real limit as to how many parameters we can have, although realistically we don't want to kind of go overboard with those. And there's no limit as to the type of variable that we can take in as inputs. Those act just as variables within a function when we use them. We can output values through a return statements, or we can just exit a function when we hit a return statement. Again, we're very flexible there. Okay, so I know this was a lot to take in, especially if you've never used functions in code before. Don't worry, they're really not that intimidating, and they're quite easy to use once you kind of understand the subtleties of creating them in Python. In the next section, we're going to be exploring some specific examples. I think we'll probably start fairly simple, and then after that, add in parameters and return statements and stuff like that. Okay, so stay tuned for those. Thanks for watching. See you guys in the next ones.